Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave and felt a righteous indignation rise from within him, and impulsively he murdered that man and temporarily hid the body in the sand and thought he had gotten away with it, but when he went the next day to dispose of the body, he was busted. Before Pharaoh could kill him too, he ran as fast and as far as he could until he arrived in Midian, and there he settled down and took up shepherding. You've been hearing this part of the story, and that while one day he was at work and he came across a bush that was burning but wasn't being burned up, and it called out to him. And the voice of God spoke to Moses to convince him to go back to Egypt and lead the Hebrew people out of slavery. Out of all the people, God chose Moses, a stuttering murderer with a stunning lack of self-confidence. Moses pleaded with God to send someone else, anyone else. But nevertheless, God persisted, and to each objection, God provided an answer: don't worry, I'll be with you. And this will show you that I'm the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain. And here we are now, 10 plagues behind us, a miraculous exit through the sea, and now they are exactly 3 months removed from Egypt, a time characterized, as you know, more with groaning, griping, grousing, and grumbling than gratitude, but now they have entered the Sinai desert and set up camp below a mountain. As it happens, the same mountain as the burning bush. And for some reason, I hadn't made that connection before, called both Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai. God had said, after you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain, and now here they are. And God called Moses up the mountain to deliver a message. Remind the people what I did to the Egyptians and how I lifted you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Tell them to faithfully obey and stay true to my covenant, and you will be my most prized possession of all the peoples on earth. And Moses came back down the mountain and told the people to wash their clothes and prepare for a holy event. And when morning dawned on the third day, the people heard the blast of a very loud horn and shook in fear. And God pounded Mount Sinai with lightning, and the horn blast grew louder and louder. And then Moses brought the people to the foot of the mountain so they could meet God. They were warned not to come too close, or they would fall dead from pure holiness. Back on the mountain, God had told Moses, I'm about to come to you in a thick cloud, and the people will hear me talking with you, so they will always trust you. And then God spoke these words for everyone to hear. I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of a life of slavery. You must have no other gods before me. And then continued. 9 more statements about idols and the use of God's name and keeping Sabbath, honoring father and mother, prohibitions against murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and not just don't take what doesn't belong to you, but don't even desire it. Thou shalt not. Moses was down with the people when God spoke through the thick darkness. And then Moses went up the mountain again. Now the story is told in both the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, each with a version of the 10 Commandments that are nearly identical, but not exactly identical. And the biggest difference is the reason for Sabbath. So you noticed how they skipped over some of the verses in the 10 Commandments? You'd think you'd just read the whole thing. Well, in the verses that are skipped over, there's a couple of reasons, but the reason to keep Sabbath is listed in the book of Exodus as connected to one of the creation stories. Because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the Sabbath, 7th day. Therefore, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Don't do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male and female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you. But in Deuteronomy, the reason for Sabbath is not connected to creation, but to what the people had just gone through. So here is what it says in Deuteronomy 5. Keep the Sabbath day and treat it holy, as the other. It repeats, don't do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your oxen or donkeys, or any of your animals, or the immigrant who is living among you. Same as Exodus. But just for clarification, Deuteronomy adds this, so that your male and female servants can rest just like you. But then the rationale is significantly different. Again, not because of creation, but to, quote, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And this text explains that's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, you are free from slavery. And now, this is how you live free. But not just you. You are not to impose different expectations upon others than I have placed on you. It is for immigrants and servants too. And in this way, rest represents freedom. Freedom from the rat race. Liberation from the constant pursuit of money, fame, or power. Rest from striving. Rest that you may remember who you were. Because once you were enslaved. But this is who God has made you to be. And this is a word not just to some people thousands of years ago. This is a word for us too. Tricia Hersey recently wrote a book called Rest is Resistance, about how to be free from the grind culture, as in constantly grinding it out. She's a big advocate of taking naps and says we all need time to sleep so that we have time to dream. Otherwise, we'll get trapped in dehumanizing systems that oppress our minds and bodies, both our own and, crucially, like the Sabbath commandment, what we expect others to do for us too. So back to the story. The people heard God speak the words of the Ten Commandments and then told Moses, going forward in the future, would you mind just please speaking to us yourself? We pinky promise to listen. Just don't let God speak to us again or we'll die. Why? Were they afraid that exposure to pure holiness was like nuclear radiation? But Moses encouraged them, saying, hey guys, it's really simple. You just live in awe of God and you won't stray from the path that God has laid out for you. God has shown you how you can be truly free from the bondage of your past. Which again is not just about some people some time long ago, but refers specifically to you and me, about what we have been through, and what can free you and I from our past mistakes and faults and failures. How do we get free? And how do we stay free? How do we stay free? Well, here it is. Make no idols out of gold and silver or Bitcoin or stocks. Rest. And let others rest too. Treat immigrants like you would treat citizens. Don't desire what's not yours. Worship just one God, not the almighty dollar or anything else, maybe like the almighty need for perfection. Don't tell lies about other people to get them in trouble or get yourself out of trouble. Honor your father and mother. Some of us might need a little clarifying conversation about all that that means. And no lying or stealing or murder. I am the Lord your God. Have no other gods before me. And so after the commandments were laid out, that's when Moses approached the thick darkness in which God was present and went up the mountain to work out the fine print. Yeah, we may think the Ten Commandments are simple, right? Not easy, mind you, but simple. But it took God 40 more days and 40 nights to reveal the rest of the instructions to Moses. Instructions about worship, instructions about slaves, instructions about human violence, instructions about animals and property, instructions about Sabbaths and festivals, and pages and pages and pages of details about building tables and lampstands and altars, and instructions about fashion for priests. Now, some of the instructions are beyond boring, to the point of causing your eyes to glaze over and fatigue to set in. And some of them, if you can weed through them all, if you can weed through them, you'll find some that are absolutely fascinating. For example, when you see a donkey that belongs to someone who hates you, right? And it's fallen under the burden of its load, you might not feel like helping it get up because it belongs to your enemy, but you must help set it free. Chapter something, something, verse something else. It took Moses so long to write all these things down, or memorize them, or whatever it was that he could do to remember pages and pages of detailed instructions. It took so long that the people started getting nervous. Maybe Moses had been vaporized by the nuclear equivalent of pure holiness, and he would not return, and they started pressuring Aaron to break the commandments almost as soon as they heard them straight from God. And that's next week. Kathleen Norris said that for years she hated hearing the Ten Commandments read aloud in church, because she said they seem so overwhelmingly negative. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Perhaps, she said, because if church folk had left them at 10, but in her small town America, 10 became 11. Thou shalt not play cards, which became 12. Thou shalt not go dancing. Her father was a Methodist preacher in South Dakota in the 1920s and 30s, and he chewed his cigars just to make sure none of his church members could smell smoke on him. And he had reason to be careful. He had been fired from a previous church in West Virginia for teaching hymns to the youth group on a banjo. You talk about thou shalt not. Now, as a boy in a strict religious home, he had been forbidden to go to a movie theater. The first day he went to college, his first day of freedom, he went to 3 movies all in a row. And wouldn't it be more appealing to hear, thou should, instead of thou shalt not? Now, we'd probably be just as prone to break them, but who knows? I mean, the prophet Micah speaks, thou should do justice, thou should love mercy, thou should walk humbly with your God. And Jesus summed up all the commandments into 2 thou shoulds. Thou should love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Thou should love your neighbor as yourself, which is actually a 3rd thou should. Thou should love yourself in the midst of loving your neighbor. So a few years ago, I came across a list of thou shoulds that I want to share as my closing. Thou should listen without interrupting. Speak without accusing. Thou should answer without arguing. Forgive without punishing. Thou should promise without forgive without punishing. Thou should promise without forgetting. Share without pretending. Thou should give without sparing. Trust without wavering. Pray without ceasing. And some advice to the wilderness wanderers munching on honey wafers and drinking sweetened water. thou should enjoy without complaining. But, just as importantly, to consider not just thou, but everyone. Right? Isn't that also the point of the Ten Commandments? Not just about you, but everyone should have a place at the table. And everyone should have clean water and bread, and everyone should have a shelter and safe place for growing. For everyone born, young and old alike, a voice to be heard, and a part in the song, the right to belong, and both thou and everyone should have the right to be free. God, may you turn the words that were both spoken and the words we heard into that which we need for our journey today. Amen.